A family's much-anticipated vacation at a luxury resort quickly spirals into chaos when they become the targets of racist police officers who deem them out of place. The situation escalates when the father, Jake Reynolds, is unjustly handcuffed in front of his wife and children. What the officers do not realize is that Jake is a veteran FBI officer. But what will happen when the truth is revealed? The Reynolds family had been eagerly planning this vacation for months. Jake, a dedicated FBI officer, rarely had the chance to relax with his family, as his demanding job kept him on constant alert, often straining his home life. His wife, Shara, a prominent lawyer and advocate for underserved communities, also juggled a hectic schedule. Despite their busy lives, they made a commitment to put work aside and spend quality time with their children. Their destination was a lavish beachside resort where the serene ocean met the sandy shore, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead. Jake, dressed in shorts and sunglasses, reclined on a poolside lounger, savoring a rare moment of peace and freedom. For once, the weight of his responsibilities seemed to lift, leaving him with a rare sense of calm. Beside him, Shara sat gracefully, immersed in a novel she had not had time to finish in weeks. On the surface, she appeared composed, but beneath her calm exterior lay a deep well of thoughts and emotions. Shara knew this vacation was essential, a chance to momentarily escape the constant demands and stresses of her career. Nearby, their two children, Mike and Anaya, splashed happily in the shallow end of the pool. Mike, a tall and mature-looking 10-year-old, often challenged his 6-year-old sister to swimming races. Anaya, a cheerful little girl with curly brown hair and a radiant smile, giggled as they played. Their joyful laughter filled the quiet resort, bringing a rare sense of peace to Jake. As Jake watched them, a wave of contentment washed over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly present with his family, free from the usual burdens of urgent work calls or unresolved cases. This moment of tranquility was something he had longed for. But the serenity didn't last. As Jake reached for a cold drink from the table beside him, he noticed a security guard approaching. The man, dressed in a dark polo shirt, stood tall and projected an air of authority. Though his expression remained polite, suspicion was evident in his eyes. The guard stopped in front of the family, his tone firm and cold. "Excuse me, sir. I need to verify that you're a guest here," he said. Jake slowly sat up, lowering his sunglasses to meet the guard's gaze directly. "I am a guest here," he replied calmly, his voice steady and confident. Noticing the exchange, Shara placed her book down, her calm exterior giving way to quiet vigilance. Shara glanced up from her book, immediately sensing something was wrong. This wasn't the first time they had been subjected to such treatment, but it never got any easier. Each encounter carried a fresh wave of exhaustion and frustration. The guard offered a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "It's just procedure," he said, his tone stiff. "I need to verify your room number." Jake remained composed. "We're in room 205. We arrived yesterday," he responded evenly. The guard nodded but didn't move. "I'll need to confirm that with the front desk. I hope you understand. It's policy." Shara, now sitting upright, quickly recognized what was happening. Her sharp eyes met Jake's, and without a word, they both knew. "Is there a problem?" Shara asked, her voice polite but resolute. The guard hesitated just for a moment before responding. "No problem, ma'am. Just routine." Jake exhaled quietly, the weight of familiarity settling over him. He had been through this before, being scrutinized and treated differently in upscale places. "Let them check," Jake murmured to Shara, his voice calm, yet weary. Shara gave him a knowing look, understanding his attempt to de-escalate the situation, but her frustration was palpable. This was supposed to be a time for their family to relax, to escape the pressures of their demanding careers. Instead, the mood had shifted entirely. As the guard walked away to verify their presence, Jake tried to maintain his composure, hoping this would be over quickly. But deep down, he knew it was only the beginning of a tense and uncomfortable experience. Jake and Shara attempted to settle back into their vacation, but the carefree atmosphere had been shattered, leaving behind an air of unease. Shara placed her book aside, her full attention now on the guard, who was returning, this time with a colleague. Both men approached quickly, their expressions more serious, and any semblance of politeness had vanished. Sensing the shift, Shara sat upright, her eyes sharp and alert, while Jake felt the tension closing in around them. "Sir," the first guard began, his tone more assertive and accusatory, as if he had already made up his mind. "We need you and your family to leave the pool area until we confirm your information with the front desk." Jake slowly straightened in his seat, his eyes never leaving the guards. "As I've already told you, we're staying in room 205. If you need to confirm, call the front desk. There's no reason to ask us to leave," he said, his voice steady, though a simmering anger lurked beneath the surface. Shara, now standing beside him, could no longer conceal her frustration. "I don't understand," she said, her tone firm and unyielding. "We've answered all your questions. Why are you still asking us to leave?" Her voice was clear, sharp, and full of quiet defiance. The guard avoided meeting her gaze, focusing instead on maintaining a veneer of professionalism. He turned back to Jake. "We've had some issues recently with non-guests sneaking into the pool area," the guard explained, his voice lacking conviction. "This is just a procedure to protect the resort." Shara's eyes narrowed. Both she and Jake knew exactly what this procedure really meant. "It's property policy, and we must follow it," the guard stated, his tone cold and detached. Shara's brow furrowed, clearly recognizing the injustice in the situation. She stepped forward, her voice growing sharper and more direct. "What is the real issue here?" she demanded. "We've provided our room number, yet you continue to question us. Is it because we look different from the other guests here? Are these policies applied equally, or just to families like ours?" The guard hesitated, his stern expression faltering. "Ma'am, it's not what you think," he replied, his tone defensive but laced with discomfort. "We're just ensuring the resort's security." His words, however, lacked conviction. The discomfort in his voice was obvious. Jake, sensing the tension escalating, gently placed a hand on Shara's shoulder, a silent attempt to calm the storm brewing within her. He understood her frustration, because he felt it too. This was not the first time they had been judged by their appearance, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Jake had faced countless similar situations throughout his life, each one leaving behind a fresh layer of frustration and exhaustion. It wasn't just the suspicion from others. It was the deeper pain of being judged solely by how they looked. "It's okay, Shara," Jake said softly, his voice steady as he tried to diffuse the situation. He was holding back the same anger she felt, but he knew they needed to stay in control. "Let them check with the front desk," Jake said, trying to de-escalate the situation. But before the words could settle, a younger guard stepped forward. His stance was confident, almost defiant, with his arms crossed over his chest. His tone was sharp and challenging. "We've had a lot of people sneaking in here who weren't guests," the younger guard said. "Don't think we're targeting your family. This is just our job." The comment lit a fire in Shara. She stepped directly in front of the young guard, her calm now completely gone. "Not personal?" she said, her voice cutting through the air. "Then why are you pushing us so hard? Why are you scaring my children and insulting us over a so-called procedure that you're using as an excuse?" Her voice was sharp, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. Jake, sensing the tension escalating, quickly intervened. His tone remained calm, but carried a firmer edge. "We've answered all your questions," he said, his voice steady but unmistakably assertive. "If you need verification, call the front desk. There is no need to escalate this any further." The younger guard smirked, a slight, mocking smile that only fueled the tension. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," he said with a shrug. If you have a problem, you can take it up with our manager. Shara's eyes locked onto his, unwavering and fierce. She wasn't backing down. She was used to confrontations like this. She faced them regularly in the courtroom. But this was different. This time, she wasn't a lawyer advocating for someone else. She was a wife, a mother, and she refused to let her family be disrespected and demeaned. Before Shara could respond, Jake gently pulled her back, his calm but firm presence stepping forward. He locked eyes with the guard and spoke with quiet authority. You have asked for our room number, and we have given it to you. We are not leaving. You can check with the front desk, but I won't allow you to continue harassing my family. The tension in the air was palpable. What had started as a peaceful day had quickly unraveled, and now their two children, Mike and Anaya, who had been laughing and playing moments before, stood frozen in confusion. Mike, the older of the two, edged closer to his father, his young face filled with uncertainty. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked quietly. Jake bent down, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, offering a calm smile despite the turmoil brewing inside. "It's nothing, son. Just a little misunderstanding. Go back and play with Anaya. I'll take care of it." But Jake knew it wasn't nothing. The situation was fragile, teetering on the edge, and any wrong move could send it spiraling out of control. The first guard, now visibly uneasy, glanced nervously around the pool area. Other guests had started to take notice. A few were discreetly watching, while others openly stared. Some had even pulled out their phones recording the unfolding scene, but none stepped in to help. They simply observed from a safe distance. Finally, the original guard, his voice strained but attempting to maintain professionalism, spoke. "All right. I'll check with the front desk right away." He nodded, as if trying to regain control of the situation, and walked off, leaving behind the tension that still hung heavy in the air. But it was clear the guard was losing confidence. "Please wait here," he said before walking off. Jake exhaled slowly, suppressing the frustration and exhaustion that threatened to surface. He maintained a calm exterior, aware that losing control could make things worse. Shara, however, was different. Her sharp eyes remained locked on the guards, unwilling to let anything slip by unnoticed. Few minutes later, the situation escalated. A group of guards returned, this time accompanied by two local police officers. Their stern faces and deliberate march toward the Reynolds family shattered what remained of the relaxed atmosphere. Conversations around the pool hushed. Guests stopped what they were doing. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others continued recording the unfolding scene on their phones. The tall officer leading the group approached Jake with a firm, authoritative tone. "We received a report of an incident here. I need to see your identification." Even though Jake was no stranger to tense encounters, his work as an FBI agent preparing him for moments like this, a wave of anger surged in his chest. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was humiliation in front of his family. Slowly, Jake stood, facing the officer with calm resolve, showing no outward signs of worry. His voice was steady and clear. "I've already explained to the security guards. My family and I are legitimate guests. We're staying in room 205. He paused, meeting the officer's gaze. "I'm Jake Reynolds, an FBI officer, and we've done nothing wrong." Despite the weight of his words, the officer's expression didn't change. He didn't seem surprised, as if Jake's credentials didn't matter, or worse, as if they were irrelevant to the situation at hand. The officer didn't flinch when Jake mentioned he was an FBI officer. Instead, he nodded dismissively and interrupted, his tone cold and commanding. "Hand over your ID, immediately." Shara shot to her feet, her eyes blazing with fury. "My husband just told you he's an FBI officer," she said, her voice sharp and filled with authority. "You have no legitimate reason to harass us like this. You have no right to treat us like intruders, especially in front of our children." The officer didn't even glance at her, his focus remaining solely on Jake. His hand hovered dangerously close to his belt, where a pair of handcuffs dangled. "Hand over your ID now, or we'll have to follow protocol," he said, his voice heavy with implied threat. Jake remained composed, fully aware of how quickly encounters like this could spiral into something far worse. Carefully, he reached into his wallet, pulled out his FBI badge and ID, and handed them to the officer. "Here's my ID," Jake said, his voice firm but controlled, avoiding any hint of confrontation. The officer took the badge, glanced at it for a few seconds, then handed it back with a sneer. "I don't care about this badge," he said with a mocking smirk. "I need real identification, not something you can buy from a souvenir shop." Shara's fists clenched at the insult, her breathing quickening with rage. "What did you just say?" she nearly shouted, stepping forward. But before she could say more, Jake gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch a silent plea for restraint. "Stay calm, Shara," he said softly, though his own anger simmered just beneath the surface. The officer's eyes remained locked on Jake, filled with contempt. "I won't ask again," he said coldly. "Provide valid ID, or we'll take this further." Jake knew exactly what was coming next. He had witnessed similar situations unfold countless times before, and the officer's tone made it clear that further action was imminent. With no other choice, Shara, unable to hold back her anger any longer, stepped forward, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Enough," she snapped. "We are guests here, and we're not going anywhere. If you continue harassing my family, I will make sure you pay for this. What you're doing is entirely unlawful, and I will take this to the public." The officer stood still, his eyes gleaming with defiance, clearly unbothered by her words. "Who do you think you are, threatening us like that?" he spat. Shara stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she met the officer's gaze, her voice steady and filled with authority. "I'm a lawyer, and my husband is a federal officer. You've made a grave mistake by treating us like this, and I won't let it go unnoticed." A heavy silence fell over the pool area. Guests who had previously been distracted now turned their attention to the confrontation. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and a few people began filming the scene, capturing every moment from a distance. The tension in the air grew suffocating, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Jake stole a glance at Shara, his heart heavy with concern for his family's safety. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, and every second that passed made him more certain that things could go from bad to worse in an instant. Jake stood motionless, knowing that one wrong move could make everything spiral out of control beyond repair. The younger officer, the one who had been challenging them from the beginning, stepped forward. He pulled out his handcuffs and advanced toward Jake, his voice cold and commanding. "Put your hands behind your back, or we'll use force." Jake remained still, his gaze steady and unflinching. His voice was calm but filled with quiet resolve. "You're making a big mistake," he said softly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He stared directly into the officer's eyes, his heart pounding but his mind clear. In that moment, memories from the past surged back, overwhelming him like an unstoppable tide. He remembered his early days as a new FBI officer, facing dangerous criminals and keeping his mind sharp during the tensest of situations. But never, in all his years of service, had he felt so powerless as he did now, standing before an officer who had no intention of listening to reason. All his years of dedication to protecting national security, all the dangerous confrontations, suddenly seemed insignificant in comparison to the injustice his family was now enduring. A vivid memory from 4 years ago surfaced in his mind. A case he had worked as the lead investigator. It had been an investigation into police brutality, a case where officers had unjustly shot and killed an unarmed black youth. Jake had interviewed dozens of witnesses, sifted through hundreds of pieces of evidence, and uncovered a painful truth. What had happened wasn't a mistake. It was a systematic abuse of power. He had fought hard for justice for the victim, but now, Jake realized, he was on the other side. He had never imagined that one day he would be the victim of that same abuse. As the tension in the air grew thicker, Jake's gaze shifted to Shara, his wife, who had always been unwavering in her commitment to fight for justice, had always stood tall in every legal battle she had taken on. She was proud of her work, fighting for the rights of marginalized communities. But today, she wasn't the lawyer defending someone else. She was the mother and wife, fighting to protect her family from the very system they had spent their lives standing against. Shara was the wife protecting her husband, and that fact pained Jake more than anything. He didn't want her to have to endure this, nor did he want their children to witness a scene that no family should ever experience. The officer raised the handcuffs, preparing to lock them around Jake's wrists, and a rush of painful memories flooded his mind. He thought back to the countless times he had arrested real criminals throughout his career. Drug traffickers, domestic terrorists, individuals who posed a true threat to society. Yet here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his country, now being treated like a criminal. The only difference? His appearance and the unjust suspicion that had been cast upon him. More memories surged forward, this time ones he had hoped to forget. Jake recalled the first time he and Shara had to explain racism to their son, Mike. At the time, Mike was only 10 years old, but he had noticed how people treated their family differently. "Why do they keep looking at us like that?" Mike had asked, his eyes filled with confusion. Jake had sat him down, trying to explain as simply as he could, but the bitterness in his heart had been hard to conceal. No matter what he said, Jake knew he couldn't protect his son from the harsh reality forever. Now Mike was older, but Jake could still see that same confusion and worry in his eyes as he stood nearby, trying to make sense of the injustice unfolding before him. Anaya, his younger daughter, clung tightly to her mother, her little eyes brimming with tears. Fear clouded the faces of both children, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness as he watched the fear take hold of his family. This wasn't just an injustice against him. It was something his children would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Jake felt his heart tighten as he looked at his children. He couldn't allow them to grow up with the image of their father in handcuffs, treated like a criminal. The thought of them witnessing this injustice hurt him deeply. In those moments, Jake also thought of his black colleagues at the FBI, many of whom had shared stories of being pulled over by police for no reason other than their appearance, being suspected in upscale stores or stopped on the road simply because of the color of their skin. When Jake had first heard these stories, he believed he could make a difference, that his work could help create a more just society. But now, standing here, facing the very thing he had always thought he could fight against, he felt powerless. He took a deep breath, telling himself to stay calm. He had been through tougher situations than this, but never had he felt so profoundly hurt, not physically, but emotionally. He knew that if he resisted or showed any signs of non-compliance, the situation would escalate quickly, and that could put his family in greater danger. The young officer, unaware of the storm of thoughts swirling in Jake's mind, saw only a black man standing before him. The officer's eyes gleamed with defiance, as if he was waiting for Jake to resist so he could justify using force. "All right," Jake said calmly, placing his hands behind his back. There was no surrender in his eyes, only a quiet determination to stay composed, for his family. He felt the cold metal of the cuffs snap around his wrists. At the same moment, he saw the panic in Anaya's eyes. Her choked sobs filled his ears as she clung tightly to Shara. Mike stood frozen nearby, his face filled with confusion and fear. It was a moment Jake would never forget, seeing his children caught in the crossfire of something they should never have to experience. Jake could see the confusion and hurt in Mike's eyes as his son processed the scene before him. Mike stood frozen, his face hardening as he tried to understand what was happening. Jake gave him a gentle look, trying to reassure him. But inside, the flames of anger burned fiercely. Jake knew his endurance today was for the sake of his family, but he vowed this was not the end. Though he remained silent for now, what happened next would not be met with silence. As the officer snapped the cuffs onto Jake's wrists, Shara felt a surge of electricity shoot through her, awakening all the anger she had been holding back for so long. The image of her husband, someone who had faced dangerous criminals without flinching, now being treated like a common criminal, made her blood boil. Shara had kept quiet long enough, and she couldn't stay calm anymore. She stormed toward the officer who was holding Jake, her eyes blazing with fury. "That's enough!" Shara shouted, her voice echoing across the pool area. The onlookers who had been quietly watching now focused entirely on her, their phones still recording. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Do you realize you're cuffing a federal officer?" The young officer, his hands still holding the cuffs, looked up at Shara with flashing defiance and annoyance. "Ma'am, if you don't step back, we'll have to detain you as well." Shara stepped even closer, showing no sign of stopping. "Detain me? You have no right to detain me just for standing up for my family. You're treating my husband like a criminal in front of our children, and I won't let this go." The older officer, who had kept a cold expression throughout the ordeal, stepped forward to block Shara. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Your husband wasn't complying with our requests." Shara let out a cold, bitter laugh. "Doing your job? Is your job to harass a legal family? To arrest an innocent man just because of the color of his skin?" Grew larger, their murmurs intensifying as more guests gathered around, watching the confrontation unfold. Some continued recording, others exchanged looks of disbelief. The older officer, sensing the situation escalating beyond his control, nervously glanced at the growing crowd. He knew this was about to spiral out of hand, and if it continued, it could explode on social media, tarnishing the reputation of the resort and the police force. The young officer, however, remained defiant. "We have the right to ask for valid identification," he repeated stubbornly, still not fully grasping the gravity of the situation. "He didn't comply right away, and that's enough for us to act." Shara could no longer contain her fury. She moved closer, stepping directly in front of the young officer, her eyes narrowing with intensity. "I told you very clearly that my husband is a federal officer, and you ignored that," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Do you understand what I'm saying? Not only have you broken the law, but you've humiliated us and traumatized my children." Mike, standing nearby with wide, confused eyes, looked on in shock. Anaya, hiding behind her older brother, clung to him, tears filling her eyes. In that moment, Cher realized the depth of the pain they were all enduring. It wasn't just about the injustice against Jake. It was about her children, too. They shouldn't have to witness their father being unjustly handcuffed. Nor should they grow up with the fear that something like this could happen to their parents simply because of their skin color. "You think I'll stay silent while my husband is treated like this?" Shara's voice grew stronger, each word laced with conviction. "You think I'll stand by while my children endure this humiliation? I will do everything in my power to bring this situation to light. You will pay for what you've done." But the pressure from the crowd, the disapproving murmurs, and the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. His grip on his cuffs tightened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. He looked at the older officer, who gave him a stern nod. The older officer took a step forward, his voice now colder, more authoritative. "Release him," he said firmly, his tone signaling the end of the standoff. The younger officer hesitated for another moment, clearly reluctant, but the sight of the cameras, the murmurs from the crowd, and the undeniable tension in the air made it impossible for him to continue. With an almost defeated motion, he unlocked the handcuffs, letting them fall from Jake's wrists. The crowd's whispers began to swell as they saw the action, some people even clapping or nodding in approval. Jake stood still, the weight of the cuffs now gone, but the emotional burden was still heavy. His eyes met Shara's, who was standing unwaveringly beside him. He could see the fire in her, the strength that had always been a part of her, and he couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude and pride. Shara, though her chest still heaved with indignation, let out a breath as she stepped back, her gaze still locked on the officers. "This is not over," she warned them, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable promise. "I will make sure the world knows what happened here today." The older officer, looking deeply unsettled by the outcome, nodded briefly. "We'll make our report," he muttered, signaling his team to back off before they turned to leave. The young officer, still fuming with resentment, shot one last glare at the family before walking away, his pride bruised. As the officers retreated, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the tension lingered in the air. Jake, now free but still processing the anger and disbelief, turned to Shara, placing a hand on her shoulder. He could see the concern in her eyes, but also the fierce determination. "We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," Shara whispered to him, her voice resolute. Jake nodded. They had faced injustice together before, and they would face this one too. This time, not in silence, but with a force that would make sure no one would forget what happened today. The battle was far from over, but for the moment, they had reclaimed their dignity and stood strong in the face of oppression. And they would make sure their children knew that standing up for what's right was worth every ounce of struggle. Mike's brow furrowed as he listened intently, still processing everything. The confusion in his eyes deepened. "But you're an FBI officer, Dad. You told them who you were. Why did they still do that?" Mike's voice cracked, the hurt palpable as he glanced at his father with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Jake took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He could feel Shara's eyes on him, the shared burden of their children's confusion pressing down on both of them. "Sometimes, Mike, people see things differently because of who you are or the way you look, and they make assumptions. They think they know something about you that's not true," Jake explained gently, his voice soft but firm. "What happened today wasn't right, and it's something we need to stand up against. But you always have to stay calm and try to do what's right. You fight for the truth, and you make sure people know when something's wrong." Mike didn't say anything right away, his eyes darting between his father's handcuffed wrists, now free, and the officers retreating with embarrassed looks. His small fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to understand, but this moment had shaken him to his core. Shara knelt down beside Mike, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all face things that don't make sense, sweetheart," she said, her voice full of emotion but also strength. "But you must never forget your worth. Your dad and I—" She paused, glancing at Jake. "We are who we are, and we are always going to stand up for what's right, no matter what." Anaya, still clinging to her mother's side, looked up at her brother with wide eyes. "Dad, are we okay now?" Her voice was small, the uncertainty clear in her gaze. Jake stood up, lifting Anaya into his arms. "We're okay, sweetie. We're okay," he said with a reassuring smile, though his own heart was heavy. He didn't want them to be afraid. He didn't want this moment to define their view of the world, but he knew they would never forget it. Shara, watching the family moment, could feel the weight of the injustice they'd just faced pressing against them. But she was resolute. She wouldn't let it break them. "This isn't over," she said quietly, looking at Jake, then back to Mike and Anaya. "We're going to make sure something like this never happens again." The kids nodded, though the confusion still lingered in their eyes. The moment wasn't over, but it was a turning point. The lesson was still being shaped, and the pain was real. But Shara and Jake knew that standing together as a family, they would face whatever came next. Together. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of guilt as he held Anaya close, her tiny body trembling in his arms. He had promised his children safety and security, and yet here they were, exposed to a harsh reality that no child should ever have to face. He looked at Shara, who was still comforting Mike, her eyes full of that same quiet rage that burned in him. He knew the fire in their hearts was not just for themselves, but for the future they had to protect. Anaya's voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she buried her face in her mother's chest. "Will they come back, Mommy? Will they hurt Daddy again?" Shara gently rocked her daughter, trying to soothe her as best she could. "No, sweetheart. They won't come back. Daddy's okay. We're all okay." But Shara's voice wavered slightly as she said it. She wasn't sure if she believed the words herself, but she knew that for Anaya's sake, she had to remain strong. Jake glanced down at his daughter, her face still wet with tears. He squeezed her tighter, his own heart heavy with the knowledge that the world had just shifted beneath their feet. He had never imagined that the day would come when he'd have to explain to his children that justice wasn't always guaranteed. That sometimes, the very people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who made you feel unsafe. "Hey, look at me, Anaya," Jake said softly, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "You don't have to be afraid, okay? I'm your dad. And I'll always be here for you. I won't let anything happen to you or Mike. I promise." Anaya looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, but the moment their gazes met, a small sense of calm seemed to settle over her. She nodded, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. "Okay, Daddy," she whispered. Mike, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, I don't get it. Why did they treat you like that? Why did they think you were a bad guy?" Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing for the words that could make sense of this to his son. He looked at Mike, his gaze filled with both love and the burden of knowing that this was a conversation they should never have had to have. "Mike, sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes they see something that isn't really there. They judge based on things that don't matter, like how someone looks or where they come from. But that doesn't change who you are or who your family is." Shara watched Jake and Mike, her heart aching for her son. She knew that today had changed something inside of him. He had always been proud of his father, of the man who kept people safe, who worked tirelessly to protect others. And now that image had been shattered. It was a reality no child should have to learn so soon. "I'm sorry, Mike," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you had to see this. You shouldn't have had to, but we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Mike, still holding back tears, finally nodded. He didn't fully understand yet, but he knew one thing for sure. His father wasn't just a man who wore a badge. He was his dad. The same dad who had held him close every time he was scared, who had shown him what it meant to be strong, to do what was right. And though his father's hands had been bound by handcuffs today, Mike could see the strength in his eyes. That, at least, was something he could hold on to. Shara wiped the tears from Anaya's face, then gently kissed the top of her head. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, though the words felt empty in her mouth. There was still so much uncertainty ahead. But for now, she would hold on to her family, protect them with everything she had, and fight for the justice they deserved. As they stood together, the weight of the moment heavy on their shoulders, Jake and Shara shared a glance. They knew this wouldn't be the end. The fight wasn't over. But they would face it together. They would fight for their children's future, for their right to walk through this world with dignity and respect, no matter what. Stood quietly, their faces still marked by confusion and fear. Mike's eyes were downcast, his thoughts too heavy for a child to bear. He had witnessed something his young mind couldn't completely comprehend, but the impact was already deep. Anaya, still clinging to her mother, had found some comfort in Shara's embrace, but her small body still trembled, shaken by the image of her father in handcuffs. Jake's heart ached as he looked at them. He knew they had lost something today, a piece of their innocence, a sense of security that they may never fully regain. But he, also knew that this was the moment where the fight had to begin. Not just for their family, but for everyone who had been silenced by injustice, for those who had been wronged and left to feel powerless. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he would make sure they faced together. Shara's voice, though calm now, was full of determination. She spoke to the officers, her eyes locked onto theirs with a steely resolve. "You've made a grave mistake today. Not just to us, but to everyone who has suffered because of this. I will hold you accountable, and I won't stop until justice is served." The young officer's defiant attitude had softened under the weight of Shara's words and the eyes of the crowd. He looked around, unease creeping into his posture as the whispers grew louder, the reality of his actions sinking in. The older officer, once so dismissive, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding Shara's. He understood now that what had just transpired could not be ignored. Jake spoke again, his voice unwavering despite the exhaustion that pulled at him. "This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's been treated like this, who has been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're criminals just for existing. We will make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Shara nodded in agreement, her resolve solidifying with every word. "We won't allow this to be swept under the rug. We'll take this to the public, to the courts, to anyone who will listen. And we won't stop until those responsible face the consequences of their actions." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the tension of a moment that could either dissipate into nothing or spiral into something far more significant. The officers stood still, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The crowd around them had grown even more silent, the phones still recording, but now with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Finally, the older officer stepped forward, his voice quieter than before. "We'll report this," he said, though his tone was lacking the previous confidence. He knew that this wasn't just a minor issue anymore. The ripple effect would be massive. "But this isn't over. You have every right to seek justice. But know this. Actions like today have consequences for all of us." Shara's expression remained firm, unyielding. "Then we'll see how far the consequences reach. We'll make sure they reach all the way to the top until things change." As the officers turned to leave, Jake could see that their walk was no longer as determined as it had been when they first arrived. They knew that their actions had consequences too, and those consequences were unfolding now, slowly but surely. The crowd, who had been silent witnesses to the injustice, began to murmur again, some in support, some in shock. But all had witnessed something they couldn't ignore. The Reynolds family stood together, their unity and resolve solidifying in the aftermath. The emotional toll of the day had been immense, but it also marked the beginning of something bigger. Their fight for justice wouldn't be a quiet one. It would echo loudly, amplified by the voices of everyone who had been silenced, by every person who had experienced discrimination and injustice. Mike, still processing what had happened, looked up at his father, his voice quiet but filled with a quiet promise. "We'll fight for this, Dad, right?" Jake nodded, the pride in his eyes clear despite the weight of the day's events. "Yes, Mike, we will." Shara looked at her family, at her children, and despite the pain in her heart, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was a small light, but it was there. The battle for justice was only just beginning, but they would face it together as a family, and they would not rest until their fight was heard. Shara's voice was steady but fierce, her mind already shifting into the mode of action she was so familiar with. She knew that the moment they stepped into the fight for justice, they would need every piece of evidence, every bit of information to ensure that this injustice was exposed for what it was. The officers might have believed they could walk away from this unscathed, but Shara was not one to let things slide, especially when it came to the safety and dignity of her family. "I'll need you to get the footage from any bystanders who recorded this," she continued, walking toward the pool's edge. "We'll need to get the names of any witnesses as well. I want everything that can show exactly what happened here. The officers acted with clear bias, and I won't let them get away with it." She could hear her colleague on the other end of the line, already preparing to follow through. Shara knew this would take time, effort, and a lot of determination, but it was something she had done countless times before for others. Now she was doing it for her own family, and she would not rest until she saw the justice they deserved. Jake stood silently beside her, his arms still slightly aching from the handcuffs, but his expression hardened by the same resolve. He was grateful that Shara was taking the lead on the legal front, but he also knew that the emotional and psychological scars from today would take longer to heal. He could see the worry in his children's eyes, especially in Mike. Mike had already witnessed too much, far more than any child should ever have to. As a father, Jake wanted to shield his children from the ugly truths of the world. But today, he had learned that no matter how much he tried to protect them, there were things they would have to learn for themselves. Shara hung up the phone and turned back to Jake, her eyes never leaving his. "This isn't over, Jake. We need to hold these people accountable. We'll make sure they never do this to anyone else again." Jake nodded, his voice low but resolute. "You're right. We can't let this go. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone else who's ever been made to feel less than." Shara smiled briefly, her fierce energy still palpable. She was already thinking ahead, planning every legal angle. She had a case to build, and she would make sure it was airtight. She couldn't change what had happened today, but she could make sure the officers who had violated their rights would face consequences, and that would send a message. Turning to her children, Shara knelt down and gently pulled Anaya into her arms. "It's going to be okay, sweetie," she whispered, though her voice wavered with emotion. "We're going to make sure this never happens to us again, and we'll do everything we can to make the world a safer place for you." Anaya, still clinging to her mother, nodded as if she understood. Mike, though quiet, walked over to stand beside his father. He looked up at Jake, his face still clouded with confusion and pain. "Dad, will it happen again?" Mike's voice was small, full of the uncertainty that came from experiencing something so unjust and confusing. Jake's heart tightened as he looked down at his son. He could see the question in his eyes, and it broke him to know he didn't have an easy answer. He wanted to tell Mike that the world was fair, that it was a place where good people like them wouldn't be treated this way. But the truth was, Jake had learned far too early in his career that life wasn't always just. And in this moment, the reality of it hit harder than ever. "No, Mike," Jake finally said, his voice steady despite the weight of his own doubts. "We'll fight for what's right, and we won't let anyone hurt us like that again. We'll make sure of it." Mike seemed to absorb his words, though the confusion didn't leave his eyes. Shara placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, her touch grounding him as she turned to face their children, her expression one of both strength and vulnerability. "This is why we fight," Shara said softly, her words meant for all of them. "We don't fight because we're angry. We fight because we want a world where our children don't have to fear the things we've faced, where no one else has to feel this kind of hurt." Anaya, still in Shara's arms, looked up at her mother with tear-streaked cheeks, but also with a glimmer of understanding. Maybe not all of it, but enough to know that something important had happened, and that her family was strong enough to face it. As the officers walked away, their heads low, the weight of the situation still heavy, Shara and Jake stood together, resolute. It wasn't the end of the battle. They both knew that. But it was a step forward. They had their family, their unity, and now they had a purpose. This was not just about what happened to them. It was about everything that had come before, and everything that would come after. They wouldn't just be victims of this injustice. They would be the ones fighting to ensure no one else would ever have to face what they had. The road ahead was long, but together, they would take it one step at a time. Jake's gaze was unwavering, filled with a quiet intensity. His wrist still tingled from the cold metal of the cuffs, and his heart was heavy with the injustice that had just unfolded in front of his family. But it was more than just his personal experience now. It was about the humiliation and fear his children had to endure, the trauma that would stay with them long after this moment. The young officer, who had been so eager to put the cuffs on Jake, stood with his back straight, clearly unsettled by the tension in the air. He glanced between Shara and Jake, unsure of what to do next. His bravado had diminished in the face of Shara's unwavering determination and the palpable anger from the crowd. "You made a mistake," Jake said softly, his voice steady but filled with quiet rage. "But it's not just your mistake. It's a failure of the system, a failure that led to this moment." The young officer shifted uncomfortably under Jake's gaze but didn't respond. The older officer, still trying to salvage the situation, stepped forward again, speaking with a calmness that seemed forced. "Ma'am, we are fully aware that this situation escalated more than it should have. We're conducting an internal investigation, and any wrongdoing will be addressed." Shara shook her head, her lips tight with anger. "Investigation?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's the standard line, isn't it? You think an investigation will fix what you've done to my family today?" She took a deep breath, her words laced with bitter resolve. "There's no investigation that can undo the fear you've put into my children. No investigation that will make my husband forget that he was handcuffed in front of his own children for no reason." The officer's eyes flicked nervously to the crowd. Some of the tourists who had been quietly recording the situation had started to talk louder, murmuring amongst themselves. Shara's warning was starting to sink in. He knew the video footage would be all over social media in a matter of hours, and this situation could escalate even further. "Ma'am, please," the older officer said again, his voice more pleading than before. "Let's not make this worse. We can work this out without involving the media, without a lawsuit. We'll take full responsibility for what happened here, and we can resolve this quietly." But Shara wasn't interested in quiet resolutions. Not anymore. "No," she said firmly, her voice steady but unyielding. "What happened here today isn't something you can sweep under the rug. You've already crossed a line, and you will face the consequences. I will make sure of it." Jake's eyes remained fixed on the younger officer, whose earlier defiance was now replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Jake could feel the anger rising inside him, the injustice of it all. But he knew this was not the time to escalate things further. The fight for justice would come, but it had to be on their terms. The older officer looked at Jake, his expression mixed with regret and wariness. "We understand," he said quietly. "We'll cooperate fully with the investigation. But please, let's keep this civil. We don't want to make this any worse for you or your family." Shara's gaze was unwavering, her resolve unshakable. "It's too late for that. You've already made it worse." She took a step back, standing beside Jake, her hand gently resting on his arm for support. The tension in the air was thick, and she could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of the decision they had just made to fight back. This wasn't just about seeking justice for themselves anymore. It was about holding the system accountable, making sure that no one else would ever have to face what they had. "We'll make sure this case is heard," Shara added, her voice low but powerful. "We'll take it all the way. You'll answer for what you've done here today." The crowd, sensing the conclusion of this tense exchange, began to disperse, though many stayed close, still recording and discussing what had just happened. The situation wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jake felt the weight of the handcuffs lifting from his wrists in a physical sense, but the emotional weight of everything that had happened hung heavy in his chest. His family was still shaken, and the image of his children witnessing this injustice would stay with him for a long time. But he was resolute. This wouldn't be the end of it. He had been through tough situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about his family, their dignity, and their right to live without fear or humiliation. Shara's voice broke through his thoughts. "Let's go home," she said softly. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Jake nodded, feeling the first signs of relief wash over him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but together, they would face it head-on. This fight was not just about their personal experience. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in the same way. As they walked away from the scene, their children in tow, Jake knew that this moment would be the turning point. They wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The manager's face tightened, his hands clasped together in a sign of nervousness. He could see the fire in Shara's eyes, the unmistakable resolve that made it clear this would not be swept away with an apology. He had dealt with complaints before, but this was different. I assure you, ma'am, we never intended to cause any harm. Our staff was just following procedure, the manager stammered, trying to backpedal, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the kind of weak defense Jake had heard countless times before when someone tried to cover up their wrongdoings. Shara shook her head, cutting him off again, her voice unwavering. Following procedure? You're telling me that calling the police on a family who were simply trying to enjoy their vacation is part of your procedure? Is that the policy you train your staff to follow here? Her tone was sharp, biting. The manager blinked, his eyes darting between Shara and Jake, his nervousness growing. No, it's not the usual procedure, but we had concerns. Concerns? Shara's voice rose, echoing through the lobby. What concerns could you possibly have about a family enjoying their time at your resort? Was it because my husband is a federal officer? Or was it because of the color of his skin? Because that's what this was. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an intentional act of racial profiling and discrimination, and it will not stand. You will be held accountable for your role in this. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was visibly sweating now, realizing the gravity of the situation. Shara's words were firm, unyielding, and the weight of her presence was undeniable. I want to make it clear, Shara continued, her voice growing colder with each word, that we won't just be seeking justice for ourselves. We will make sure that everyone knows what happened here. This will be public. The world will see how a family was harassed and humiliated for no reason other than the color of their skin. And your resort will be part of that story. The manager stood still, his face pale as he absorbed the full force of Shara's resolve. He knew there was no escaping this. No amount of corporate jargon or empty apologies would make this go away. The evidence was already in the hands of the public, captured by phones and shared across social media. The firestorm that was coming for the resort was inevitable, and it would burn bright and hot. I understand, the manager said, his voice weak. I'll report this to corporate. We'll cooperate fully with any investigation. Cooperate? Jake repeated, stepping forward. His voice was calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. It's too late for that. You've already failed us, and now you'll face the consequences. You think reporting this up the chain will absolve you? It won't. We'll make sure your part in this is exposed, every last detail. The manager's face flushed with embarrassment, and he took a step back, looking almost defeated. He glanced over at the officers still lingering by the entrance, and his unease deepened. Shara gave a final, sharp look toward him. This is just the beginning. We will fight for what's right. No amount of damage control will change what happened today. With that, Shara turned to Jake, her eyes filled with a burning resolve. They had already started this fight, and there was no turning back now. As they made their way out of the hotel, the weight of the moment settled in. They had been wronged, but they were not powerless. This was only the start of the fight, not just for their family, but for the many others who had faced similar injustices. Mike and Anaya walked behind them, their faces still marked by the confusion and fear they had experienced. They were processing what had just happened, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew one thing for sure. Jake and Shara were not just fighting for justice. They were fighting for their children's future, ensuring that their kids would never have to face such cruelty again. Shara pulled out her phone again, already drafting a message to the media. This would not be a story confined to whispers in the corners of social media. It would be front and center. As Jake walked beside her, he turned to glance at his family, their faces reflecting the pain and strength they had collectively endured. He knew that the journey ahead would be long, but with Shara by his side, he felt the unwavering belief that they would come out of this stronger. No matter how many obstacles they faced, they would stand together. And this time, they wouldn't just let it slide. The battle for justice had only just begun. Deputy Chief Paul's eyes briefly lingered on Jake, recognizing him as an FBI officer. His posture shifted slightly, but he didn't let the recognition affect his professional demeanor. He glanced over at the young officers, the resort manager, and the growing crowd of onlookers who were still recording the events unfolding. The tension in the air was thick, and Deputy Chief Paul knew this was not a situation that could be swept under the rug. "I've been briefed on the situation, but I need to hear directly from all involved," he said, his voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. His gaze turned to the younger officer who had cuffed Jake. "What happened here?" The young officer opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, his usual bravado fading in the face of the deputy chief's calm authority. "We were called to the scene because of a disturbance. The individual," he glanced at Jake, "didn't provide his identification when asked, and that led to us cuffing him." Deputy Chief Paul raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced by the officer's explanation. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Is that the full story, or are we leaving out some important details?" Shara, standing beside Jake, didn't wait for the officer to continue. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "What you're leaving out is the fact that my husband is a federal officer, and your officers decided to treat him like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. You can't explain that away with some flimsy excuse about identification." Deputy Chief Paul's gaze shifted to Shara, then back to the young officer. The discomfort in the young officer's posture was evident, and Deputy Chief Paul knew that the situation was far more complicated than the officer had initially admitted. "I see," Deputy Chief Paul said, taking a moment to assess the gravity of the situation. He turned to the resort manager, who was visibly sweating under the pressure of the unfolding chaos. "And what about you? Why did you call the police in the first place?" The manager stammered, his face flushed with anxiety. We had a complaint about a disturbance, sir. We thought the situation was escalating." "Escalating?" Shara interrupted, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me that you couldn't have handled this situation without involving the police? You couldn't ask for identification without bringing the police to arrest us? This wasn't about a disturbance. This was about racial profiling." Deputy Chief Paul glanced at the manager, who was now visibly shrinking under the weight of Shara's accusations. He knew this would be a high-profile case, one that could easily escalate beyond the walls of the resort and the local police department. He took a deep breath, stepping closer to Jake and Shara. "I understand the seriousness of this situation," he said, his tone more measured now. "I will personally ensure that a thorough investigation is conducted. This will be handled at the highest level." He paused, glancing at the young officer again. "As for you," he said, his voice firm, "I expect a full report on this incident, and I will personally review the footage of what happened here today." Shara's eyes narrowed, her posture unwavering. "That's not good enough. An internal investigation? That's just a way to cover up your officer's actions. We'll be taking this to court, and we'll make sure it's public." Deputy Chief Paul's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging the gravity of the statement. "I'm not here to cover anything up," he said, his voice now carrying a bit more weight. "But I will be sure that this is handled properly, and I expect full cooperation from all parties involved." Shara nodded, her eyes not leaving his. "You'll have full cooperation when we make sure this doesn't happen again," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. The deputy chief took one final look at the young officer and the resort manager before turning to Jake. "I'll make sure this is investigated fully, and I'll keep you informed every step of the way. You have my word. Jake didn't say anything immediately. His eyes locked on the deputy chief, weighing the sincerity of his words. He had heard promises like this before, from people who didn't follow through. But this time, something felt different. There was no denying the pressure this case was going to create, and Deputy Chief Paul seemed to understand the weight of the public scrutiny. Finally, Jake spoke. "We're watching," he said, his voice steady. "We'll be making sure that you follow through, and we won't stop until we get justice." Shara's hand found Jake's, their fingers intertwining. They were a united front now, determined to see this through no matter what. Deputy Chief Paul turned and walked toward his officers, signaling them to follow him. He had said his piece, and now it was up to his department to prove that it could handle this with the integrity it needed to. The manager, still shaking from the encounter, watched as the deputy chief exited the lobby, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Shara turned to Jake, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of resolve. This fight was far from over, but they had taken the first step. They weren't just fighting for their own justice anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever faced this kind of injustice. And they wouldn't stop until it was righted. Jake stood tall, his expression resolute as he addressed Deputy Chief Paul. He wasn't looking for words. He was looking for action. "An apology doesn't erase the humiliation we just experienced," Jake said firmly. "My family was traumatized today, and you need to understand that this isn't just about the actions of a few officers. It's about a system that lets things like this happen over and over again." Shara, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. "You talk about investigating, but we've heard this before. I want real steps taken. I want to know who will be held accountable, and I want timelines on what will be done." Her voice was unwavering, filled with the weight of her demand. She wasn't going to let this slide. Deputy Chief Paul listened intently, his face serious. He knew the gravity of the situation. He had seen public backlash before, but nothing like this. The pressure was mounting, and the last thing he needed was for this incident to snowball further into a scandal. "I understand your concerns," Paul said, his voice measured but with a hint of frustration. He could tell this wasn't just about appeasing them with words. They wanted accountability, and they wanted it now. "I will make sure that this investigation is thorough, and it will not be swept under the rug. I will personally oversee it." Shara's eyes never left him, her gaze hard and determined. "I want transparency. I want to know exactly what's happening at every step. If your officers violated any protocols, I will ensure they're held responsible and that this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jake added, his tone unyielding. "We're not just fighting for ourselves here. We're fighting for everyone who has faced this kind of treatment. We're not backing down." Paul's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I will work with internal affairs to ensure this is done properly. I understand how serious this is, and if any violations were made, there will be consequences." He turned his gaze to the older officer, who was now visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "You all need to understand that the reputation of this department is on the line, not just for the department, but for the trust of the community." The young officer who had cuffed Jake shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him. "I never meant for things to get out of hand," he muttered, but no one was listening to his weak attempts at justifying his actions. Shara's voice cut through the silence, her words cold but resolute. "Your procedure isn't an excuse for what you did today. You chose to escalate the situation when it should never have been escalated in the first place." The deputy chief looked around at the officers, his eyes finally softening for just a moment as he acknowledged the weight of the situation. "This is a learning moment for all of us," he said, his voice now taking on a more personal tone. "We need to get this right. I'll make sure the investigation is as transparent as possible, and I'll personally see to it that the facts are laid bare." Jake didn't trust that this would be enough just yet, but for the first time that day, he felt the tide turning. He gave Paul a sharp nod, but his eyes said more than his words ever could. "We'll be watching, and we won't let this go. As Shara and Jake exchanged a brief look, both knew the road ahead would be difficult. They would need to navigate the legal system, expose the truth, and ensure that this didn't become another forgotten incident. But they also knew that they were far from alone. This case would spark conversations, and their determination would fuel a wider movement for justice. Paul watched the family for a moment longer before turning away, signaling for the officers to follow him. He had made his promises, but it was clear that the road ahead for him and his department was going to be difficult. The investigation had only just begun, and whether it led to real change or simply more empty words would depend on how seriously they took this moment. Shara and Jake remained where they were, standing united. The future was uncertain, but they knew one thing. This fight had just begun, and they would not rest until justice was served. Became sharp and commanding. You! He pointed at the young officer who flinched under the deputy chief's gaze. Will report to Internal Affairs immediately. You are to explain your actions in full, and I expect a detailed account of what transpired today. Understand? The young officer nodded quickly, his face pale. He had not expected to be so publicly reprimanded, and the fear of the consequences was beginning to sink in. His eyes darted toward Jake and Shara, who stood silently, unwavering. Paul turned back to Jake and Shara, his expression now more serious, though still tinged with the weight of the situation. I understand your frustration, and I will ensure that this is not dismissed, he said, his voice softer but with a note of finality. You will have our full cooperation moving forward. I will personally ensure this case is given the attention it deserves. But I need you to provide all the evidence you have. Shara's gaze was unwavering as she looked at Paul, her voice firm. We will provide everything. But I want to make one thing clear. You don't get to hide behind procedure or protocol when people's lives and dignity are on the line. This isn't just about an apology. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone again. Jake stepped forward as well, his eyes locked on Paul, his tone resolute. And I'll be holding your department accountable if this is swept under the rug. I've been part of the system long enough to know how these things can go. I won't let it happen. Paul met Jake's gaze, his features unreadable, though there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. It was clear he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of the situation. I assure you, we will not sweep this under the rug. If anyone here acted inappropriately, they will face consequences. I understand what's at stake here. Shara nodded, her eyes still cold but resolute. We'll be watching. Every step. We're not going anywhere. With that, Jake placed a hand on Shara's shoulder, his calm demeanor belying the anger still simmering beneath the surface. He could feel the eyes of the crowd still on them, recording every moment, and he knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about holding the system accountable, about making sure that no other family had to go through what his had. Deputy Chief Paul nodded once more before turning to the officers. You heard them. Report immediately. We will handle this properly. With a final glance at the Reynolds family, he walked away, his mind no doubt already focused on how to manage the fallout. Shara turned to Jake, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything that had transpired. This isn't over. We're just getting started. Jake's expression softened slightly as he looked at her, his voice a quiet promise. I know, and I'm with you every step of the way. As they left the resort, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. The path ahead would be long, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny. But for the Reynolds family, there was no turning back. The fight for justice had begun. Jake placed a hand on his son's shoulder, looking down at him with a reassuring smile. Your mom and I are here, Mike. No one can take that away from us. Mike looked up at his father, his eyes still searching for answers. Dad, what happened? Why did they do that to you? You didn't do anything wrong. Jake knelt down to his son's level, his gaze steady and filled with both pain and pride. Sometimes people make mistakes, Mike. They judge us based on things they don't understand. But that doesn't change who we are or what we stand for. Shara placed a hand on Jake's back, her heart swelling with both sorrow and strength as she watched her children process the chaos they had just witnessed. We'll help you understand, Mike. We'll keep teaching you that there's a better way to handle things and how to stand up for what's right. Anaya, still in her mother's arms, whispered softly, "Daddy, will they hurt you again?" Shara kissed her daughter's forehead, her voice filled with reassurance. "No, sweetheart. Daddy's strong, and we're stronger when we're together. No one will hurt us again. We'll make sure of it." The air around them seemed to shift as Jake and Shara exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had won the first battle, but the war for justice had only just begun. Their family had been tested in ways they never imagined, and the scars would stay with them. But so would their determination to make sure this kind of treatment never happened again. Not to them, and not to anyone else. As they turned to walk away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, the whispers fading into the background. But the recordings, the evidence, and the voices of those who had witnessed the injustice would not be forgotten. Shara knew that the story of their family's fight for justice would spread beyond this resort, across the city, and eventually across the country. Shara's phone buzzed in her pocket, reminding her that the next steps would come quickly. She glanced at it, then back to her family. She knew the legal battle ahead would demand everything from her, but she was ready. They were ready. And this time, they would not be silenced. "We'll make sure the world knows what happened," Shara said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "We'll make sure it counts." Jake looked at her with quiet admiration. "Together," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. Together. Shara, walking beside them, felt a surge of pride as she looked at her husband and children. The battle ahead would be long, but she knew that they were ready. This was not just about the humiliation they had endured. It was about the principle, the fight for fairness and dignity for everyone who had ever been wronged like this. Mike looked up at his father, still processing everything he had witnessed. His youthful innocence had been shaken, but Jake's words seemed to steady him, providing a sense of hope in the face of uncertainty. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," Mike said quietly, as if repeating the resolve he had heard from his parents. "That's right, buddy," Jake said, ruffling his son's hair. "We're going to make sure that this injustice is brought to light, and we'll make sure the world sees it." As they walked out of the resort, Shara's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then looked back at Jake. Their legal team was already preparing for the next steps, and Shara knew that the work ahead would be exhausting, emotionally and physically. But there was no turning back. They had committed to this fight, and they would not stop until justice was served. The resort manager watched them leave, the weight of his helplessness hanging in the air. He knew that what they had done, the discrimination they had been part of, couldn't be easily swept under the rug. The eyes of the public were now on the story, and the consequences would follow. Jake and Shara exchanged a glance as they stepped into their car. The air was thick with both sadness and resolve. But they knew they were on the right path. They had already taken the first steps in making sure their family's dignity and the dignity of others who had suffered similar injustices would be defended. Shara placed a hand on Jake's as they both stared ahead, their minds already working through the next steps. The journey would be long, but they had the strength to keep going. "No turning back," Shara said quietly, her voice strong and unwavering. Jake nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. "No turning back. Oppression and fight for what is right. It's a reminder that one family struggle can spark a wider movement, shedding light on systemic issues that need to be addressed." In the face of adversity, the Reynolds family found strength in each other, and their resolve grew stronger as they set their sights on bringing real change. As they walked away from the resort, their hearts heavy but hopeful, Shara's phone buzzed once more, signaling that their legal team was ready to take the next step. They were already planning meetings, gathering witnesses, and preparing the evidence needed to build their case. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, knowing they were doing something meaningful, something that would have an impact. Their children, though still processing everything, felt the courage in their parents. Mike, now standing tall beside his father, found a new sense of purpose in the world around him. Anaya, though young, could sense the change in the air, the unwavering love and unity that surrounded her. She would grow up with a deep understanding of the value of standing up for what's right. Jake and Shara exchanged a glance, their eyes reflecting the same quiet determination. The journey ahead was going to be long and difficult, but they knew they were not alone. Their community, their support system, their legal allies, everyone who had rallied around them, would help carry them through. As they drove away, the weight of the situation still heavy on their shoulders, they knew that this was just the beginning. The road to justice wouldn't be easy, but they had made their decision. They were going to fight for a world where no family would ever have to endure what they had. Their story was now part of a much bigger narrative, one that would make a difference. The fight for justice had begun, and the Reynolds family was ready to lead the charge. They had the courage, the strength, and the love to take on whatever came next, and this time, they were not just fighting for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The story of the Reynolds family is a powerful testament to the importance of standing up against injustice, not only for one's own rights, but for the rights of others as well. It reminds us that silence in the face of discrimination and wrongdoing only allows such actions to continue unchecked. But when we rise, speak out, and fight for truth, we can make a real difference, not just for ourselves, but for a better, fairer society for everyone. The challenges the Reynolds family faced serve as a call to action for all of us. We are reminded that we should never be afraid to speak out against injustice, that unity and family love have the power to overcome even the greatest obstacles, and that with perseverance and courage, we can work together to create a world where everyone is treated equally, with dignity and respect. This story is a beacon of hope and strength. It shows that by taking a stand and not backing down, we can change the future. It shows that one family's fight can inspire change on a much larger scale, proving that when we fight together, we have the power to shape a more just world for everyone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking content.